Well, good morning, Northview. How are you guys doing this morning? It is so good to be with you. Hello to everybody who's joining us online. We're grateful that you could connect with us today, too. If you have a Bible with you or a Bible app on your phone, Exodus 20 is where we'll be today. We're continuing in the series called The Big Ten. We're looking at the Ten Commandments. And as you guys turn there, I want to tell you a story that took place when I was in high school in church. I think I could honestly say this is one of the most memorable, if not the most memorable Sunday I ever had in church as a teenager. And I didn't always go to church because I wanted to go to church. My mom and dad were going to be there on a weekly basis. I was going to be there whether I wanted to be there or not. And like every teenager, you go through moments and seasons where you're not thrilled to be there. And so you look for joy in other places and other ways. And God does work in your heart through the whole thing, which is really, really cool. But I was usually living for where are we going out to eat after dinner or after church and things like that. But on this particular day, I remember because we're talking mid to late 90s. And technology-wise, your mind kind of has to go to that era. So you're talking Windows 95 era, PowerPoint, kind of the dawn of some of that technology. And a way that a church in that day showed you that they were relevant, modern, really kind of on the edge was to be using PowerPoint on their sermons every week. And so we had a 4x3 projector that put the sermon content on the wall. And my preacher at our home church, man, he especially loved PowerPoint. He would do like a 49-point PowerPoint for every sermon. We didn't have cameras, we didn't have a whole lot of technology, but he would click us through his slides every single week. This particular week, he was teaching on patience. And so he developed this whole slideshow on patience. Every point he had to teach, every corresponding verse, all about patience. The problem was, and really what made the morning fun for me, was that he misspelled patience in every single slide, all 49 of them. And so instead of patience like the virtue, he spelled it like patience like the people at the hospital. And so, verbally it all sounds pretty much the same. You can't tell the difference. But when he would start to walk through his points, there would be this little murmur and this little giggle out in the crowd. So he'd say something, I'll show it to you because you got to see it to really appreciate it. He'd say like at the beginning, what is patience? Let me define it for you and let me kind of help you see what patience is. And let me talk to you about the importance of patience. Okay, we're going to talk about the importance of patience. Here are 4 reasons to cultivate patience. And every time this is happening, we're just laughing. I'm just chuckling. Okay, the next time might be something like this: the benefits of patience. The benefits of patience. Eventually, he would probably get to a place where he would start to turn the corner and help to show us how the character of God would influence the way that we took on this virtue. So he might have said something like this: God's patience with us sets our standards with others. And so by the time we're kind of rolling through the sermon, and there's times where I look out at you guys and I'm kind of wondering, like, what are they laughing about? Like there's a few of you out here having a little side conversation, and I don't know if my fly's down. I don't know if you're talking about something I said, or if it's like you guys are talking about something totally irrelevant or a text that just came in. I don't know. But this room was just full of little murmurs every point as this thing was building. And now I am in a spot where I don't really want to be here, but this is getting good. This is really getting good. But the cherry on top of the sundae, you will not believe me, but I promise you, this was his final point in the slideshow: executing patience. I mean, like, there's just no holding it together. I don't care what decency you have. Like, when you get to that, like, it's over. And again, he's stunned. He has no idea. I leaned over to Dad, and I remember saying to him in a way that I felt like connected me to him, hey, that's a different sermon. That's a different sermon. And Dad replied, yes, next week, thou shalt not murder, right? Right? Well, funny enough, that's where we're going today. It's time for that one. It's time for that sermon. We've found ourselves for the last several weeks in this ancient moral code that God passed down to the nation of Israel, after being delivered out of slavery, he said, I'm going to set you apart as a unique people. And I can tell you a whole bunch of things that are going to define you, but I'm going to reduce it down to 10. And I'm going to say, this is going to define who we are as a community of people. These first 4 are going to define how relationship between you and me are going to work. And then the next 6 are going to define how you're to do relationships with each other. And how you do relationships with each other will be a direct relationship or direct reflection on our relationship as well. And so we get to the 6th commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. It is the shortest. It is very succinct. It is very clear. You shall not murder. You shall not murder. Now, you hear it, and it's, again, straightforward. You see the boundary, and it seems to be like we don't have to talk a whole lot about it. I will say this is kind of interesting to me as a parent, that commandment number 6, you shall not murder, followed, children, honor your parents. Like, I wonder if there was any of those, like, I brought you into the world and I can take you out, type conversations. And so God had to temper some of that struggle that happens in parenting with this one. I don't know if that's the case at all, if these are connected in that way at all, but it's very close and very dear to the heart of God, this commandment. Let's talk about what it is. Let's talk about what the word means. You shall not murder. God could have used 8 different Hebrew words to describe killing. 8 specific words that all would have a little bit of different influence and nuance as to what they meant. He chose a specific word. It's the word called ratzach. And this particular word doesn't address all kinds of killing. It only addresses murder. What I'm saying is that I think there's been a misnomer on this conversation a little bit. The old King James translation would just say, thou shalt not kill. That's not really a great translation of what the word actually meant. The commandment was about murder. This commandment doesn't address capital punishment. It doesn't address killing in war. It doesn't address self-defense. In fact, you will see all of those spoken to and given conversation in their due time in both Exodus and Deuteronomy and other places in the Old Testament by God. God himself calls for at times or justifies those types of killings in a couple different places. That's what the commandment doesn't say. So what does it say? What does it say? Well, before we go there, let me remind you the context. 400 years, these people have been slaves. 400 years, they've had really no identity as a nation. They've been mistreated. They've been treated as less than. They've been brick makers, pushed and just like grinded out. They have witnessed with their own eyes the Egyptians murder family members and friends. And now, having been rescued by God, as he sets up these 10 commandments, God is telling his people, you're going to live differently than what you have seen in the world around you. And we're not going to murder. We're going to honor life. We're going to honor life. This word, murder, thou shalt not murder, specifically is talking about, if we were to bring this into our language, our words today, a handful of means of death. One would be homicide. Another would be suicide. And a third would be abortion. Those might be the 3 most obvious connections into our world and our understanding of what was this commandment speaking to. That's the boundary. But like we've done with all these commandments and will continue to do, we're asking the question, what is the heart behind the command? Not just the letter of the law, but what is the heart? What is God's heart behind the boundary that he sets? The heart behind the command is that life is sacred. Life is sacred. So celebrate it, don't extinguish it. Murder is so final. It is so tragic. And God says, my people won't be defined by it. Over the years, I've done many funerals and many that have been really, really hard. But one of the hardest ones that I ever did was for a murder victim. I told you guys a story a few weeks ago about a phone call I got early in the morning one time when I was a chaplain of an arena football team from the head coach saying, hey, we got a problem. This guy on our team that lit his apartment on fire, said God told him to do it. He jumped out of a window, and now we've got a kind of mess on our hands. And so met with him and talked with him. That was an unexpected call. It was not the hardest call that I ever got from him. The hardest one was when he called me to tell me that his wife's 20-year-old brother had been senselessly murdered over in Seattle, shot in the back of the head as a result of a dispute. And just out of words, out of perspective, out of just anywhere to go in that moment, in desperation, he called to see if there was anything I could do. Could I meet with them? Could I talk with them? Could I do the funeral? And I remember the day of the funeral, and I remember how beautiful the day was in Seattle. I remember the setting, the garden park-like setting for this outside. But words struggle. I struggle to find words to describe how brutal, senseless, and tragic that was. And so in part, God is using this as a boundary to help us understand that there is a line in the sand that you cannot cross because it is so final, it is so total. But he didn't speak this command simply so that we could see a line and toe the line right up to it and say everything short of that is okay. The goal was not to avoid death. The goal was to embrace, celebrate, and respect and honor life. And sometimes it takes death to get our attention and allow us to see life as it truly should be seen. At many funerals you've been a part of and I've been a part of, this is understood. That it's in death or in the face of death that we see and respect and treasure and celebrate life. Many funerals are not called funerals. They will specifically stand up at the beginning and say, this is a celebration of life. That's at the heart of this command, is that every life is God-formed. The image of God is tied to every human being. And so because his hands have been involved in the forming and shaping and creating, since his image is in every human being, and since every human being is unique and special in their contributions, in their abilities, in their personalities, in the things that they love, these kind of things start to go and make up for us what makes each of us so special, so unique. And God's command is to draw emphasis to that and to celebrate that, to recognize that life is a gift from God. Do not murder because life is sacred. God made it. He guides it. He enriches it. He preserves it. So don't get in the way of what he has made so special. The heart of the command is that life is sacred. But there's even more in this heart conversation, and I think it's important to kind of keep going down that road. Because when Jesus begins his ministry, he decides that this is a conversation that needs a little more airtime. As much as we might say, well, it seems to be pretty clear to me, do not murder, Jesus thought there needed to be more conversation. And in his most famous sermon early in ministry, it was called the Sermon on the Mount. This is Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. He sets forth a conversation where he takes things that people understood from Old Testament law and says, you know the letter of the law. I want to show you the heart of the law. You've heard it was said, but I say. And in each time, he raises the bar for our understanding of something that he was saying. In this particular case, he says in Matthew 5, verse 21, you've heard it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who's angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or a sister, Raka, this is a word that would have been said in anger, is answerable to court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Jesus' point in this conversation, to those of us who might say, well, I've never or will never cross that line. To say, guys, this conversation about murder is a lot closer to you than you think, because the root of murder is anger. Eleanor Roosevelt famously said that anger is one letter short of danger. I think it serves as a reminder of where anything that has happened with our hands originates. We think of murder often as something wrought with hands. Somebody's life was taken. Our hands did something. But every action of the hands has come from a motive in the heart. It's come from something that's going on the inside. It's more of a heart issue than a hands issue. And at the heart of this command stands God's heart for your heart. He wants to not just treat symptoms, He wants to treat the root causes of the kind of things that separate His people from living the life that would best reflect His character. So when we look to the New Testament, when we look to Jesus, we see this conversation taken to another level. We see that Jesus shows us the road to murder starts in our heart and is a lot closer than we think. We also see in Him the juxtaposition of an irony of Him experiencing the very thing that He prohibited. As a solution for the problem that exists in you and I related to murder, specifically because murder starts in the heart. This conversation got a little more real when you started to realize the line isn't just, have I killed somebody, but have I harbored anger in my heart? And has that anger began to set me up against God in a form of rebellion? The answer is yes. And it's in Jesus' own murder that He showed the only way our violation of this command could be fixed. Now, I don't know if you thought or think about Jesus and His death on the cross as a murder, but that's exactly what it was. If by definition we're talking about taking the life of an innocent person in a premeditated way, that's exactly what happened. He had done nothing wrong. He was morally pure. There was no fault in what He had done. Specifically, as it relates to any form of anger He had experienced, He had had an experience, any experience He had with anger, He had experienced without sin. And in this twist of irony, He experiences the very thing that God prohibited. It's at the hands of murderers that His life is taken. He was handed over to the Romans to be crucified. The Romans had become masters of torture. And crucifixion itself was a cruel, warped expression of the darkness of human souls, where they basically said this: how can we make someone's final act of rebellion punishable by death? How can we make it hurt as much as possible and last for as long as possible? And their experiments to find the answer to that question are what led to crucifixion. Excruciating, awful, terrible pain. Beaten, scourged, hung on a cross, left to die of any number of reasons. Jesus hung there for 6 hours. Before He hung on that cross, He had an experience that I think shed some light on what kind of pain He was experiencing in that moment. That murder was more than just about physical pain, it was also about spiritual pain. The night before He was arrested, before He was crucified, He was laying down in a garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. He was so overwhelmed with grief and sorrow and stress that He was sweating blood. And He spoke multiple times in prayer to the Father and said, if it is possible, let this cup pass. The cup is it's a reference to God's wrath in the Old Testament. Multiple times in the Old Testament, the Bible will use the metaphor of a cup that's poured out or a bowl that's poured out. Jesus is referencing that image. It's a picture of God's wrath that's being poured out. It's His wrath not towards Jesus Himself, but on behalf of you and me, and the wrath that our sins and our trespasses, specifically murder, anger, and any other sin, that He will drink or take in. That was what was overwhelming to Him. That was what was causing Him to stress and to be so troubled. And it's in the moment where the physical pain and the spiritual pain met its It's climax, it's worst, it's total pain. That Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That reference was a direct quote of Psalm 22. Far from simply Jesus questioning why this was happening, it was actually him placing his faith and his heart and his trust in his Father, because that psalm talks about the ultimate redemption that would come through that suffering. He did this to what end? Why would he suffer? Why would he allow himself to be brutally murdered? Why would he allow what God forbid to happen to him? He did this so that we could be restored, so that our earthly relationships could mirror our heavenly ones. Because without his substitutionary death, the debt that our sin on this topic or any topic would have been more than we could have ever paid. But by offering his life as a perfect payment, one who had never sinned, he was able to extend to anyone who would believe in him forgiveness, grace, reconciliation. And so in the New Testament, we see not only that the letter of this law has moved to the heart, and the moving to the heart has a conviction level that applies to everyone, we also see that we have an invitation from one who was murdered to accept the gift that he offered on the cross, not because you deserve it, but because he loves you, because he wants to gift it to you, and in doing so, offers you the invitation to throw away the old life and to put on a new life. And again, in an irony or a paradox of paradox, we do this by putting to death or killing ourselves, denying ourselves, taking up a cross and following after him, losing our life to find life in him. Colossians chapter 3, Paul talks about this, where he says, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, with kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if you have any grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. I know that sometimes you hear a verse like that, especially if you're a little bit cynical about faith, and it sounds like a verse that should be written on a shirt that your grandma would wear, or a coffee mug, or hanging in the wall somewhere. But can I tell you the context? Can I tell you the author? He was a murderer. Legit murderer. Paul, in his life before Jesus, was a murderer physically. Not just like he had anger issues, like he actually killed people. And he authorized other people to kill people, specifically Christians, who claimed that Jesus was Lord. But when he met Jesus himself, and he understood that Jesus' own murder on a cross was payment for his sin, it changed him forever. And so what he's writing about in Colossians 3 is this incredible gift and this miracle of new birth, where we're given the opportunity to put off the old self and to put on a new self. And I guess that's where I want to go to kind of summarize this conversation of where do we today live in this reality, seeing that God drew the line, understanding what he was saying and wasn't saying, looking to the New Testament of how Jesus not only saw it and affirmed it, but raised the bar on the conversation and then died in our place to cover any transgression related to that offense and any others that we've had. How then should we live in light of all of this? I think there's a few quick applications that we could make. Number one, to put out the fire of anger at the foot of the cross. There is a fire that burns in us from time to time, and for some of us, for way too much of the time. We all get angry, but sometimes we feel consumed by anger. And anger can become the dominant emotion that we feel. And everything we do, everything we think is focused through that anger. Maybe it's a result of something happening that's made you angry. Maybe it's something that's broken, a friendship or divorce or loss or grief. Maybe there's some residual anger from an experience or abuse or addiction from childhood. In many ways, for many reasons, our lives can be disfigured by this anger. An anger that won't let us go. Anger is a deeply human emotion. And I don't know that I have to prove it to you, but if this helps, it took 4 chapters in the Bible for it to show up. By Genesis 4, we've got a dead person. We've got a brother killing his brother because of anger. Because of anger. And the overarching conversation about anger in the Bible is this, that anger cannot be handled. The only thing to do with it is put it out. The only thing to do with it is put it out. No anger can last of any kind and be good. Paul talks about in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Like there are things in life that should provoke you to anger, but the time to stay angry is short. In your anger, do not sin. I'll use this metaphor. If you had a fire in your house, anywhere, kitchen, bedroom, living room, garage, family room, anywhere. Like I'm just not like a fireplace fire. I'm talking like just something was on fire in your house. There would be no response that you would have that's like, well, it's just a small fire. It's okay. Like in your home, any fire is a bad fire. Anywhere it's burning, the only response to it is put it out. Nothing good is going to come if we do nothing with it. It's the same way with anger. If there's anger, the only thing to do is put it out. If you do not, you cannot handle it. You can't control it. You can't try to direct it. You have to put it out. And you do so by going to the foot of the cross and recognizing what was done to redeem you. To understand that it was anger and hate and discord that put Jesus on that cross, that he's died to cover that sin. Put out the fire of anger at the cross. Put down, here's the next one, put down the sword and let God avenge and judge. Sometimes when we get angry because we're impatient with God. We're not willing to wait for him to do his thing. It's like you're upset and you feel justified in your anger, and you might be right, but the reaction can be wrong. Sometimes when a sense of justice just won't go away, we have this propensity to say, God, I'm going to give you 10 more minutes, and if you don't step in, like I'm going to handle this, okay? Like this is what I do. Like if you would have stepped in, none of this would have happened. But you're not. I'm all right. I mean, you made me do it, and we go. Romans chapter 12, verse 19 says this, dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will revenge, and I will pay them back. That's a position of faith that requires you to take a long view and knowing that in light of all the things that God has demonstrated about who he is, his character, and his involvement in your life, his promises that come through Jesus, forgiveness, grace, resurrection, all of that, that what he's done in the past is enough proof that he's going to come through in the end. And that my temporary uncomfortableness with his timeline, at some point, by sitting back and not taking matters into my own hands, it's going to be worth it, and I'm going to be glad I did. Leave it to God, because he can do it better, more thoroughly, and completely than you ever could, and his way of doing it won't create issues that you will later have to apologize for. Put down your sword. Let God avenge. Lastly, put on Christ. Peace. His patience, spelled the right way. Patience. Humility. Forgiveness. Like the very things that Christ embodied when he reconciled you in a relationship with him. Put those on. Put off your old way of handling pain and anger. Put on a new way through Christ. What we see in Colossians and Ephesians is that Jesus tore down, the wording is, he tore down the wall of hostility that separated us from him. And in putting away anger, putting away the sword, allowing Christ's example to be what we go by, and not any other example we see in the world. What we're doing is we're understanding that since he tore down the wall of hostility between me and him, I will let his grace worked out in my life tear down the hostility between me and somebody else. Romans 12 says, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I've always appreciated that verse because it's not saying you will live at peace with everyone. You can't control the other side of a conversation. But it's saying as far as it depends on you, your role, your responsibility is to put out the fire of anger. Your role and your responsibility is to put down your sword. Your role, your responsibility is to clothe yourself with Christ, to take His peace, to take His humility, His forgiveness, His grace, His patience, and wear it like a cloak. Bring it over you and into you and allow it to transform emotions and pattern responses and behaviors that are not submitted to His will. Put on Christ and experience fullness. Experience the paradox in those moments that comes from, look, if I don't do this, if I don't say this, if I don't respond, then this truth is going to be perpetuated. That's a lie. Then this injustice is going to continue on without being stopped. And this struggle is never going to be stopped. And God is saying, trust me and step into this with me. Die to yourself. Allow me to do the work without you intervening, to carry that weight that you could never carry. When you do, what you find is that what felt like would cause you to die is what actually brings you life and change and newness. And that's what I want for you to experience today. So your response today may be to receive grace. Before you can be graceful with someone else, you have to receive that grace first. Forgiven people forgive people. People who have been grace given become grace driven. It starts with understanding what has been done on your behalf at the cross by Christ. Receiving grace from the pain of the past, your choices and others, whether that's words or deeds, as it relates to this topic of murder. Whether it's something you've done or said, maybe it's an abortion that's been held over your head for so many years, and you just don't know how you're ever going to stand before God. Jesus died on a cross for your sins in totality, not just some of them, so that He could tell you that by receiving His grace, you are free. You are pardoned. And when you receive that kind of grace, it can't help but want to live itself out in life. So resolve to honor life, to dignify life, to celebrate life, and not to destroy life in all ways and in all forms. Make it your goal to treat life as precious, to celebrate it. It's sacred. It's God created. Let's live in the gifts that God has given us in Him and in each other. My hope and prayer for you today, church, is that as this conversation has come alive in you, that equally so will the grace of God that compels us forward to the next step. In fact, I'm going to invite you to stand with me if you would, and just join me in a word of prayer as we get ready to worship. And if that next step is a conversation step, I want to invite you. Come to the back as we worship. I'd be happy to meet with you and pray with you. Come to the Connect kiosk after service. We'd love to help you. But let's just take this time to respond and to allow God's work on the cross through His Son to do its work in our hearts. Heavenly Father.